Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to everyone who's joined us this morning for the webinar, Fiscal Ready for Natural Disasters, State Strategies for State Leaders. This is an important and timely topic for all our states, and we have a great turnout today of state legislators and other leaders from across the four regions of the Council of State Governments, and you'll be hearing from some terrific speakers and panelists in just a few minutes. My name is John Davis. I am the CSG Midwest Staff Liaison for the Midwestern Legislative Conference's Energy and Environment Committee. This is a binational bipartisan committee of legislators from across the Midwest that is helping to host this webinar. Our committee is just getting started with its work for this new biennium, and we will be meeting in person for the first time at the Midwestern Legislative Conference's annual meeting in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, coming up on July 27th through the 30th. The MLC's annual meeting is open to all state and provincial legislators from the Midwest. So if you have not yet registered to join us, please go to csgmidwest.org and take a look and sign up to join us in Saskatoon. Several committee members have joined us for today's webinar, and to all of you, I say welcome, and please check your inboxes and mailboxes to watch for updates on the committee's work, our plans for Saskatoon, how you can get involved, and how to make the most of your committee membership. Welcome to all of you. And I will now turn it over to my CSG Midwest colleague, Tim Anderson, to introduce our webinar and speakers.
Thank you, John. Yes, my name is Tim Anderson. I'm Director of Policy and Research for CSG Midwest. We much appreciate the Pew Charitable Trust for partnering with us on this webinar, as well as for everyone who has joined us this morning. Throughout the webinar, we welcome your comments, your questions. At any time, please ask questions or raise your hand. Our CSG staff will be monitoring the chat and the raised hands. We'll make sure your questions are asked and that you have the chance to make comments. Over this next hour, we're going to get insights from Peter Muller, a senior officer with the Pew Charitable Trust's Managing Fiscal Risk Project, which really is an invaluable policy resource for states on budgeting for fiscal risks, in particular, in this case, for natural disasters. We're also going to hear from Massachusetts Senators Joe Comerford and Minnesota Budget Director Anna Mingy on how their states are improving their fiscal readiness and planning for natural disasters. But first, I do want to bring into this discussion to help us kick off the webinar, Trina Sheets. Trina is going to share with us the important work being done by the National Emergency Management Association, or NEMA, and discuss how NEMA's work is tied to sound fiscal management in the states. NEMA is one of the state affiliate organizations of the Council of State Governments, and through the longtime leadership of Trina as its executive director, NEMA is truly a model of how states can learn from each other, support one another, and work together. So Trina, thank you much for the work that you are continuing to do at NEMA, and thanks for joining us this morning to talk about your work.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today on this very timely topic that is also very much in the news these days. NEMA is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization representing the state emergency management directors and their agencies in the 50 states, U.S. territories, and District of Columbia. State emergency management directors are appointed by governors to be responsible for all hazards, disaster, and emergency preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. And many state emergency management directors also have the designation of Homeland Security Advisor. NEMA provides national policy leadership on emergency management issues. We facilitate the exchange of best practices between states, and we also advocate for emergency management to Congress and the federal government. NEMA also administers the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC. And EMAC is a congressionally approved national mutual aid agreement that allows states to share resources across state lines during governor-declared emergencies. EMAC is state law in all 50 states, D.C., Guam, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and the Northern Mariana Islands. The compact provides protections for personnel deployed into disaster areas like workers' compensation, tort liability, licensure, and reimbursement. Mutual aid through EMAC is quick, efficient, and much more cost-effective than requesting federal resources. And with the potential for less federal assistance following disasters, EMAC is likely to be in greater demand. Normally, emergency management isn't very well known or understood by the general public, mainly because they work behind the scenes most of the time. Emergency managers don't have uniforms, lights, or sirens, and most often they're working in the State Emergency Operations Center, coordinating resources and response actions across government and with volunteer organizations and the private sector. Most importantly, emergency management is responsible for educating citizens on actions they should take in advance of disasters to make themselves, their families, and their places of business more resilient. Disasters are becoming more frequent and causing greater devastation, and more states are experiencing back-to-back events that place a significant strain on resources. Excuse me. We've entered hurricane and wildfire season, and both are predicted to be very active. There are also a number of states and communities currently recovering from devastating tornadoes, including Missouri and Kentucky, to name just two. State emergency management agencies have historically been underfunded and understaffed. They rely heavily on federal funding, mainly through FEMA, to support their staffing and programs. Tim, I apologize, but I am, my throat is closing up and I'm just going to have to take a break for just a second, step aside. I apologize.
Absolutely, Trina, for sure. Please, yeah, take a few minutes. Let me know
sorry.
when you're. Yeah, no. Let me know when you're ready to go again. But this will give a nice opportunity. If you do have questions, please just enter them into the chat or raise your hand as we go along. When as Trina, even as the speakers are going along, and after each speaker, we want to leave a little time for folks to have a little discussion among each of the with each of the panelists. So please just keep that in mind. And hopefully Trina will be able to join us again in just a minute. Let's just give her a little bit of time to catch her breath here. One thing too, just to note, and Trina mentioned it at the beginning, but the Council of State Governments has several affiliate organizations, basically of different kind of state associations. And Trina's work at the National Emergency Management Association is one kind of example of that. CSG has several supports in several ways, different affiliate organizations. And Trina, it looks like Trina's back on. NEMA is one of the many organizations, affiliate organizations affiliated with CSG. Trina, are you okay to proceed now? Or
Tim, I do have a question in the question and answers.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
How can states better prepare themselves as funding and resources are being cut across the board on many programs that serve the general population?
Well, that's a great question. I think that some of our future speakers will be addressing some of that question. But Trina, I think you kind of referenced it before, but maybe you could expand a little bit as you get back on here about kind of that issue that I think we're hearing a lot about in our states in terms of, and particularly about emergency management response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. That's a first for me and not in a good way. So I'm not sure what happened. I will try and continue on. But I know that many of you may have seen national news reports that President Trump wants to eliminate FEMA. And we're already seeing fewer federal disaster declarations being approved, and hazard mitigation funding is no longer automatic for states after a declared disaster. And the president has publicly said that he wants states to take on greater responsibility for disasters, and that he wants to see less reliance on FEMA if it continues to exist in any form. And we already know of a number of federal programs being cut or reduced, which will impact state budgets. So I wanted to just outline a few examples. So the per capita indicator for states to be eligible to receive a federal disaster declaration may increase up to 4 times the current amount. It's currently $1.89. So just using my home state of Kentucky as an example, meeting the current threshold would be about $8.5 million in damages. At 4 times that amount, the state would have to demonstrate over $34 million in damages to be eligible. At 4 times that amount, that's a lot for a state with limited resources, but also has experienced a record number of disasters in recent years. So no official announcement has been made of the change to the per capita indicator, but it's what we're seeing in real time. Also, the administration has indicated there will no longer be 100% federally funded disasters. The Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or the BRIC program, has been canceled. And this year it would have provided $882 million to communities for risk reduction and resilience projects. So now cities and counties will have to either halt those projects or come up with money themselves. And as everyone knows, infrastructure projects are incredibly expensive. So there's concern about the ability to fund such projects in the future without federal support. The State Homeland Security Grant Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative will be reduced in the next fiscal year with a 25% cost share required for the first time ever. And we know that many state budgets have already been approved for the coming year, and many also have 2-year budgets in place. So this new cost share will cause states to have to come up with additional money or reallocate existing funds. And some may even have to forego Homeland Security grants if the cost share can't be met. So the Election Security Grant Program has been reduced, and there's also concern about the future of the state cybersecurity grant program. Public health emergency preparedness funds have been reduced, which will affect state and local public health's ability to coordinate with emergency management and respond to future disasters. And just the very future of FEMA is uncertain. The president has established a FEMA review council to develop recommendations for either reforming or eliminating the agency. There are 3 current or former state emergency management directors on the council, 1 FEMA regional administrator, and 2 governors from disaster-prone states. So we're very hopeful the practitioners and those knowledgeable governors can help improve FEMA where needed, and improvement at FEMA is indeed needed. But improvement in a way that preserves their funding and authorities to coordinate across the federal government and with states. The Review Council's report is due to the president in October. So in closing, as federal budget pressures mount and program priorities shift, states need to anticipate reduced or delayed federal funding for disaster preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. So those states having their own state-funded disaster assistance programs in place will be better positioned to withstand these immediate reductions in federal support. NEMA will continue to advocate to Congress and the administration for sufficient time, to allow states to adjust their budgets. But what we're seeing out of the White House so far doesn't give great confidence that will be possible. So that's a lot of gloom and doom, I know. But the good news is that states are ready for disasters and already handle the vast majority of them without federal help. And they can also rely on each other through EMAC when additional help is needed. So I know that our speakers today are going to share some model fiscal practices with us, and I look forward to hearing their remarks. And I'll turn it back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Trina, that was terrific. Thank you. We have a few just questions before we move on to our next presentations. I hoping you can address. The first is, when it comes to mutual aid, when states aid one another in a disaster, has FEMA been a funder of that, or are there other ways that states are able to fund that kind of mutual aid amongst each other when it comes to a natural disaster? And then, sorry, second question here. Are you concerned about the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund for this fiscal year? The latest FEMA monthly report shows that that fund will have a deficit of $7.8 billion by the end of the fiscal year. I guess it continues on. Your OMB Director Russ Voigt said erroneously during a White House briefing that the fund will get us all the way to the end of the fiscal year. So I guess those are the 2 questions that have come up that maybe you can address, Trina.
Sure. Taking the mutual aid question, EMAC is in essence a contract between states. So the state that requests the assistance, they will reimburse the other state for the salary for deployed personnel, for equipment, for commodities. So it's a state-to-state contract in which reimbursement is provided. On the disaster relief fund, yes, we're very concerned that it will run out of funding by the end of this fiscal year. And we're hopeful that the White House will submit a request to Congress for additional funding, and we won't have to delay projects and delay recovery, waiting on Congress to approve a supplemental. So we hope they'll be proactive in that regard.
Well, Trina, thank you. And as you did so well too, you really teed up with some of the things that you talked about, the importance of what Peter's going to talk about here. And so really great segue. I mean, so let's move on to that next part where we're going to hear from Peter. As I said earlier, the Pew Charitable Trust is just a terrific resource for state leaders on this issue, which is a really obviously always been an important one, but maybe now so more than ever before. And helping lead much of this work is Peter Muller, who's joining us. He's a senior officer for Pew's Managing Fiscal Risks project. Peter, thanks so much for the work you've been doing on this topic and for sharing your research and findings. I'll turn this over to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm Peter Muller. I'm very excited to talk about state disaster budgeting today. My team at Pew has been working on this topic, really trying to understand the state role, the role of state budgets in the disaster funding landscape that is very intergovernmental and complex, as I think you heard a little bit about there already. We've been working on it for about a decade, and we've recently released a report that is really geared. It's called How States Can Build Disaster-Ready Budgets. It's really geared to be actionable recommendations for states to structure their budgets in a way that where the budget gets less disruptive when these disasters do occur. This is never the thing that anyone wants to be spending on, but you often don't have a choice. And so trying to structure your budget in a way to make it so that it is planned, so that it isn't as undisruptive as possible, that you can kind of go forward and really think about reducing risk over the long term is stuff we've been thinking about, and we hope these recommendations are helpful. I'll go through a few of them, but if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to go and read the report itself as because it gets into more detail. I'll just start off. I don't think this first slide should be much of a surprise to anybody on this call. Disasters are getting more frequent, severe, and expensive than ever. This is using NOAA's billion-dollar disaster database information, which is just how many disasters had $1 billion in damage in each of the last 5 decades. And you can see the orange bars there showing the number of events going up each decade, and the blue bars showing the cost of those events increasing dramatically. All of this is adjusted for inflation. And this is particularly dramatic when you consider we're only halfway through the 2020s right now. So that cost is going to go up. So there's really strong evidence that this is a growing pressure across the economy in general. But we're talking about state budgets and government budgets, not just the impact of disasters on the economy as a whole. So then the question is, what are the things that states are paying for, or that governments are paying for in general, and states in particular are paying for within that kind of growing cost of disasters? And states really play a role in paying for things both before, during, and after a disaster strikes. Before, you have investments in mitigation, those risk reduction activities, investments in preparedness, or during a disaster, paying for things for response, and after in recovery. And I'll highlight a few areas that we've seen as sort of growing cost pressures that have been getting a lot of attention, specifically at the state level. One is this idea of response and recovery costs for those non-federally declared disasters. Even before we had any sort of potential change in policy at the federal level, we're seeing more and more of these smaller disasters, and I almost hesitate to call them smaller, but they're small enough that they are not reaching that threshold for a federally declared disaster, but for whatever community they're affecting, they're often still very devastating. And so the state plays a role in stepping in and supporting those local governments, in some cases supporting individuals there. As we're seeing more and more of those events, the fiscal pressure there on states is increasing. There's also growing pressure from the larger events. Even when the federal government is stepping in with support, there is a state and local cost share, typically 75 federal, 25, some combination of state and local. Many states play some role in that cost share. In a few states, it's left to the locals, but for the most part, states will pay all or some of the cost share that the federal government requires. As those disasters become more frequent and more expensive, that 25% or 12% or whatever it is means more dollars coming out of state coffers. And then we've also seen a growing, and this is a positive development, a growing interest in investing state dollars in resilience and disaster mitigation. And that's going to pay off over the long term in slowing the growth, slowing some of those trends, if we can do it right. But in the near term, that is also a cost pressure that is important to plan for. So is this trend of cost is that we see economy-wide, is that showing up in terms of state spending as well? In just a second, I'll talk about why we don't have good data on state spending itself on disasters, and I'll talk about why in just a second. We do have some glimpses here that I've put on these charts. Minnesota's disaster contingency account that you'll hear about from another speaker in a moment. It's been around since 2014, and you can see how that the spending, the inflation adjusted again, spending on that has increased over the last decade. You see California's wildfire suppression funding has also gone up over time. So there is this upward trajectory of the amount of money that states have to spend. And I don't have to remind you all that every dollar you're spending on disaster stuff is a dollar you can't spend on something else. And so how do you plan for what those needs are, and how do you make sure the money is where it needs to be, is what I'm going to get into now. So that was the problem. Laid it out. We know disasters are more frequent and severe. We know it's going to cost you more money. Why is this particular budget challenge, and why, and what can you do about it? And we've boiled this down into a nice little alliterative 3-word set of principles. We measure, manage, and mitigate. For measuring, we think it's really important that states take steps to actually understand what the cost is to their budget across agencies and across funding streams, and really get their hands around what the impact is to this budget. If you don't know what you're spending, it's hard to start to get it under control. Managing, it's really important. We think it's important. There has been in the past, some states have taken a reactive approach, wait until a disaster strikes and then figure out how to deal with it. It's really, as these become more frequent and more severe and more expensive, it's going to be more important that states begin to treat these things as a matter of when they happen, not if they happen, and plan for them as if it's something that an expense you're going to have, if not this year, then the next or the year after that. And we have some strategies for how you can do that more effectively. And then finally, mitigation. You got to reduce the cost. You got to bend that cost curve down over the long term, and investing in mitigation, not just putting more dollars there, that is important, but also thinking about how you structure those dollars so that the dollars turn into money, or sorry, the dollars turn into projects on the ground that actually reduce risk, which is the thing that's going to give you the payoff over time. So I'm going to give a little bit of detail on each of those before I turn it back over. First, in terms of measuring, why don't we know what states spend on disasters? We know pieces of it. We know if we know, we could look at your emergency management agency's budget and figure out what they're spending, what federal funds they get, what they spend out. But the problem is, this isn't just an emergency management. The spending doesn't just happen in emergency management agencies. Yes, it happens there. Also happens in public safety, in transportation. For wildfires, it happens in forestry. Maybe a housing agency gets involved. It's spread across countless agencies across all levels of government, federal, state, and local. When you factor in that federal spending comes in, but maybe takes multiple years to show up on to show up, if you don't have somebody who is doing the work to gather all those pieces from all those different places and put them in one place to give a really productive report, a really useful report to policymakers that says, hey, the spending was this from all these different places, then it's really like the data is there. When people write checks out of state government, you know what it is, but collecting it all in one place to make it useful for policymakers is really hard. We have a few examples of some states that are doing this well in pieces. In Virginia, agencies report their disaster response spending to the Emergency Management Agency so that they can get some reimbursements out. But that means the Emergency Management Agency then has all of those expenses and can put out a consolidated report. So you get some idea of what the cost is across the state for different agencies, which is useful in starting to wrap their arms around what those costs are. In California, a couple of years back, they made a $2.7 billion investment in wildfire risk reduction. And so to provide transparency and tracking of where that money was going, they put out a public dashboard that really looked at what types of projects this was going towards, which agency was managing them, where the location of the projects were, what their status of completion was. And that kind of information is going to be really useful for when you're ready to make the next investment. You know which places have already been treated, how they've been treated, and you can start to make informed decisions about where that next round of investment should go because they have that better information. So starting to build out the data environment is really important. As for managing proactively, we really recommend beginning to think about proactively providing funding before disaster starts. And so that means regular funding in some form that can, the way disaster costs run, it's a real challenge. You might have many years where you have no or very low disaster related costs, and then you have something big one year and it's a big spike. That is really a hard thing to budget for in many ways. So if you are looking at your trends of what you've spent in the past and putting money away year by year through some sort of mechanism, we have a few different examples in the report, different ways states have done this, but some sort of mechanism to put money there before, then when the disaster does hit, it is still a problem, but it's not, you don't have to scramble and pull resources from all the other things that you've put in the budget because you've been planning and it smooths out that impact over time. North Dakota does a version of this by putting some of their oil revenue into a disaster fund up until a certain cap. I'll also point out this example from Montana. Another challenge with being really proactive is federal reimbursements, as I've mentioned, play a really important role, particularly for the biggest disasters, but they often come multiple years after the disaster happens. That means the state or local governments can be on the hook for the full freight upfront, which means you have to have a lot of cash ready to, or you're waiting and not recovering and not helping communities get back on their feet in time. So what Montana does is when they do get federal reimbursements for their wildfire suppression spending, they roll that money back into their suppression fund so that money from the last disaster can help be the upfront costs for the next one to kind of smooth. Again, the whole idea is disasters are really up and down, really volatile, finding ways to smooth that cost so that you can be more predictable in all of the other things you want to pay for. I also heard Trina mention this idea of some states have public assistance programs, state-run disaster support programs for communities and individuals. So some states don't, but we've seen that even in states that don't have those programs set up, sometimes those states will often still provide support, but maybe do it on an ad hoc basis. That is really hard to plan for from a budget perspective. If you have a program, you can do a projection, you can know what your expenses might be. But if you're just waiting until the disaster happens and then seeing what the political will is to provide support and how much that might be, that's hard to budget for. And it's hard for people on the ground to plan for because they don't know what they're going to get. And it makes recovery slower. It just adds to uncertainty in a really trying time. So the more you can define what the state's role is going to be in providing support after a disaster, the more certainty and better planning and just better prepared you can be all the way around. And that I think the example I have on here is applying that same principle to the idea of the state agencies. Say you have your Department of Transportation has a certain amount set aside for repairing old bridges or filling potholes. If that money gets diverted to a disaster expense in the wake of a big disaster that maybe affects something that they have to spend money on, well, then you don't have all that pothole filling money that you had thought you had in the budget. Some states have a strategy for using emergency money, using disaster money to supplement that. So you still get all the pothole filling or all the bridge replacement that you had originally planned in your budget, and you're being clear, emergency money is going for the emergency expenses. The last point that I'll get to before I turn it back over is on mitigation. And this is really essential to getting investment in mitigation right is really essential to reducing the costs over the long term. And our recommendations here are kind of twofold. One is you have to invest, the first is just straightforward, right? Invest in mitigation, but not just put dollars in, do that, but do it in a way that is both recurring in some form, recurring or regular, so that that planners can expect that if they make a plan in year one, that phase one will have money in phase one, but phase two, money will be there for phase two and phase three as well. So that if you're thinking long term, you're going to get better decision making You're going to get more money for bang for your buck. You're not going to have to do scramble emergency, pay extra fees and all that stuff. But then also invest in planning capacity. You need to have experienced, knowledgeable people who know how to turn money into actual risk reduction projects on the ground. People who know where the risk is, who know what kind of interventions are going to address that risk, and who can make the projects happen. And so you don't want where your employment for the people who do that goes up and down in the wake of each disaster. Recurring funding to make sure you have that capacity in place is really essential, so that when money is available, you can put it to its best use. The other element I just want to note is the scale of the need of mitigation is enormous, and it is far beyond the ability of state budgets to pay for by itself. So thinking really carefully about how you maximize investment from everybody who has skin in the game is important, whether that is making sure your locals are getting as much federal benefits as they possibly can, because that's still mitigation happening in your state. Some states have really interesting programs where the state provides an incentive to local governments to do mitigation, to invest their own resources in mitigation, and they get a state benefit as a result, but more mitigation to be done. And then there's some really interesting strategies out there to get homeowners or the private sector more broadly investing their own money, incentivized to invest their own money in risk reduction and mitigation. We needs to be an all hands effort. So thinking about structuring your budget to get that multiplier effect, to get everybody moving in the same direction, is a really important goal. I will leave it there. I'll just say that as this is growing and as we have uncertainty in the state role, increasing uncertainty in like what the state role will be relative to the federal government, now is a really important time to be thinking about how your state structures the funding for these things, what you need to be prepared for, and how you can apply some of these ideas. So if you do have any questions, if you want to think through how these things might apply in your context, I would love to talk to any of you. Tim, I'll pass it back to you.
Peter, terrific. Thank you so much. There are a few questions, and again, we do welcome more either in the chat, Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand too and speak, that would be great as well. Peter, question, do we have, and this kind of, Trina mentioned this too, and I'll try to weave this in here too, but to this question, but do we have data or an understanding of how many disasters that states declare that do not rise to that, I guess, federal level where, you know, basically how many disasters are already basically being managed at the state level without federal assistance? And oh, great, Trina's here too. Maybe she can help chime in too, Peter. But
yeah, that's not something I have collected. It's certainly an interesting question. I'd be interested to see if Trina has an answer. If not, that might be a new project for me.
I can tell you, for example, back in fiscal year 23, that's the latest data that we have. States handled over 23,000 events on their own without federal assistance. During that same time period, there were only 60 federal disasters declared. So that's a very clear example that state and local governments truly do handle most disasters on their own.
Well, that's incredible, Trina. Also, you had mentioned the possible significant raising of what I guess I think you called it a per capita indicator that would, I guess, trigger a federal response and intervention and help. Is that correct? So if that got raised, you might see even more that the states would be handling on their own.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. One other, Peter, question before we go on. In terms of how states either are investing in mitigation or handling even the management part, is that being done through capital budgets or more just kind of a year-to-year general fund budget? Where's this money coming from? Is there planning for capital budgets that's more looking at these natural disasters and how to fund long-term for these?
Yeah, a number of states have been setting up chief resilience officers or resilience offices themselves as one way to set up the planning portion. But putting money into some states have revolving loan funds to provide kind of the upfront costs for mitigation. There have been some states that have put money through capital budgets as well. There's a range of options on that front. Okay,
great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for those questions, everybody. Keep them coming, and if you'd like to speak to, raise your hand, but we'll move on now because we're going to hear kind of, Peter gave a great overview of some examples around the country. on this issue of planning for natural disasters. We're going to hear about two particular states now that have taken steps to develop fiscal practices that aim to improve how they plan for and can respond to natural disasters. And to start, I'm really excited and pleased to bring in State Senator Jo Comerford from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She's going to talk about a new law and how she became a real champion of this important fiscal reform in Massachusetts. That's a very new law, and Senator Comerford was really a driving force behind what Massachusetts has recently done in this area. So, Senator, thanks so much for coming on, and congratulations on your recent successes there.
Well, it's all a team effort, right? I have Pew to thank, I have CSG to thank, NCSL. There are a number of state bodies that have been urging states like Massachusetts on to do better. So I'm really glad to be with you and so glad to be in the company of today's speakers. So I represent a district called the Hampshire Franklin Worcester district. That's in the lower left of your screen, and that's 25 cities and towns. 15 of them are in a county called Franklin County. It's the most rural county in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It spans, my district as a whole spans 782 square miles, which is quite large for Massachusetts. It borders both Vermont and New Hampshire. The smallest town in my district is Leiden. It has 734 people, a budget of 2 million. So a lot of small towns, and they have small town challenges. I also have a lot of natural and working land. So you can see pictured on the lower right, the Connecticut River, and at the top, the Quabbin Reservoir, which provides the drinking water for most of eastern Massachusetts. We also are home to hundreds, more than 400 farms. And so it's a vibrant place, but a place that really is connected to the land in a disproportionate way when it comes to Massachusetts. So what led me to start working on this and start looking and researching and talking with the good folks like Peter and Pew was a storm that happened in 2021. So it was a microburst, and there was flooding and thunder. And you can see some of just a few pictures from towns like Irving, Warwick, and Deerfield, millions of dollars in damage. And actually, I thought what Trina said was really important in terms of the difficulty that we're concerned about with regard to FEMA, but also Trina and Peter are talking about the current challenges with getting a disaster declaration. So in this case, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency worked with FEMA to see if our totals would actually rise to the level of a federal disaster delegation. And while our counties were eligible, the state as a whole wasn't. And so the state of Massachusetts was on its own. And one thing that I will say that was a challenge for us that just came up in Peter's talk was how local communities are able to track and report on accurately the damages. That was one of the things that came up and continues to come up in Massachusetts. And one of the things we're working on in the legislature is building the capacity of these great emergency management directors to be able to come together with a state emergency management agency like MEMA and respond. So there was no emergency management declaration at the federal level, yet we had about 20 million worth of damages. And so in 2021, I worked with colleagues in the Senate, the Massachusetts Senate, and we were able to return 7.5 million because we had ARPA funds in the state, again, well short of the 20 million total disaster, but still something to help these communities. And that was 2021. And in 2022, I went to NCSL in San Diego and heard from Pew and learned actually that Massachusetts was one of a very few states in the nation that had no stated disaster relief program or a mechanism for funding. And so we started working on legislation, but not quickly enough, because in July 2023, we again experienced a natural disaster. This is a picture from a Franklin County town. We had a storm and it caused widespread flooding. So these were a second July storm in 3 years. And the Connecticut River overflowed its banks. And here you can see Senator Warren and on the far right, Congressman Jim McGovern. And I'm there with some state officials and also Representative Natalie Blais, who is my partner in this. And when the river overflowed its banks, because there was also sewage overflowing in many of the Connecticut River towns, the crops were adulterated. And even if they would have been pickable because they hadn't fruited yet, the raw sewage made it impossible. And so these farms had major losses. We anticipate about 40 million in loss along the Connecticut River. And then also we had municipal damage. So these pictures are from a town called Deerfield, and you can see that a too small culvert was completely insufficient, and their whole road collapsed. And so we had many, many things like, many instances like this. So we were able, in the wake of no presidential disaster, to again rise as a state. And we were able to get $20 million for farms appropriated and $15 million for municipalities. And here's the Senate President, Karen Spilka, who was then leading the Senate, and behind her, the Chair of Ways and Means, Mike Rodrigues. And again, they're both still in leadership in the Massachusetts Senate. And they said, okay, we're not going to get a FEMA disaster declaration. What are we going to do as a state? And so Massachusetts came forward and we put in 20 million for farms. It was the first time we had helped private entities in anybody's working memory in the Commonwealth. And we also helped municipalities with $15 million. Again, insufficient when you think of the totality of what they were struggling with, both municipally and also in terms of the farms, but important to be able to mitigate and help counter the enormous losses that these entities experienced. And so, again, I filed a bill, the Commonwealth Disaster Preparedness Relief Fund for Emergency Management. And so we were able to pass that because Governor Healy thought that it was an incredibly important piece of legislation. And so she worked again with Senate leadership and my office and Representative Blais. She put this in her fiscal year budget blueprint. And we were able to accelerate the passage of that bill. And in that first pass through, we put in $15 million. We just appropriated $15 million. However, this bill anticipates actually siphoning off capital gains revenue before it hits what we call the rainy day fund. And we think it's actually appropriate to siphon off some capital gains revenue and create a self-sustaining fund. However, while we created the disaster relief and preparedness program within the Commonwealth, and we funded it with $15 million in one-time funds, we were not able to this time create the replenishing fund. So we're at it again, and Representative, and this is a picture of me with Governor Healy during the time of the floods. And so we're at it again. So Rep. Blais and I have filed another bill, and this is about maintaining the State Disaster Relief and Preparedness Fund. And we are hoping to invite our colleagues, both in the administration and in the legislature, to understand that one-time funding still leaves us vulnerable, because that means we have to appropriate it in each of these budgets. And it can be, as everybody knows, I'm sure, on this call, it can be subject to appropriation, makes it vulnerable to competing with many other worthy things. So we're looking to set up a replenishing fund. We're also looking forward to something called an environmental or resilience bond bill, which is forthcoming. And we're hoping that we will also establish a resilience task force for the Connecticut. This is a picture of the Connecticut during the 2023 flood overflowing its banks. And we are also looking for more money to replenish a program called the Municipal Vulnerability Program. And this goes back to what both Trina and Peter said about, we not only do we have to respond, which we can and should do in states, but we have to prepare and plan. And so the Municipal Vulnerability Program in Massachusetts is an excellent program. It provides both planning grants and response grants, and it helps communities deal with the growing threat of climate change. So we're looking forward to an opportunity to, through bonding, really turbocharge both of those programs with the right amount of money, and then also hopefully be able to create a fund, whether it's through capital gains or not, that would replenish automatically with a larger sum of the base, so that we really could be equal to what we know are the sums that are coming, especially now, as we share concern that FEMA will be less of a partner to states like Massachusetts. So that's it for me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Wonderful, Senator Comerford. Just if you could, and maybe Peter can chime in too, but you mentioned that a possible dedicated revenue source that you're thinking about some of the capital gains revenue. Has there been discussions of other revenue sources, or is that still the one that would be most likely if you were to get a dedicated revenue source? And then the other question is, do you have like a certain level you want to reach, and is there a maximum on this fund, or can you just talk a little bit about what you thought about there?
There are other revenue sources that we certainly could snag in Massachusetts. I happen to like the capital gains because we divert it in large part to what we call the rainy day fund, and it does feel appropriate to see the synergy, right? When a disaster strikes, it is a hard time for a Commonwealth like Massachusetts, and so I like that. But that's not the only revenue that we could potentially use for an automatic replenishing. And actually, in working with Pew, we chose at the time $250 million as a base that we wanted to have available. Because as you saw in my quick synopsis of 2021 and 2022, the amount of loss far exceeded what the state was able to do, even though I'm grateful to state colleagues for being able to appropriate this money and soften the blow of the disaster. We could, I believe, do a better job at responding, even as we try to put more money into planning and preparedness.
And Peter, do any states have that level, that 250 million set aside for this kind of response to disasters? Or?
Well, so if you look at North Carolina, that was just hit with Hurricane Helene, they had a very well-funded rainy day fund. And the way they are structured is the rainy day fund is partially intended for disasters as well. Some states have it separate, some have it combined. So they were actually able to appropriate, it was over $1 billion for an extraordinary event. That said, that is money that would otherwise be used for an economic downturn. So there is having that combined, there is they need to think now about how to refill that. But that is having that level. You need to match the level of amount you put aside relative to your risk, for sure. Mm-hmm. I will just say on the capital gains thing, one nice thing about that type of revenue source is that is a volatile revenue source, right? You can't rely on it for a steady year-to-year salary, because some years it's way up, some years it's down. So taking a volatile revenue source, and when it is up, setting it aside to help pay for a really volatile expense like disasters is something we've seen in a couple of places, and it's an intriguing idea. Montana does something similar with when they have revenue collections that exceed what they budgeted. So if they overcollect what they anticipated, they will put some of that money, because that is, again, a volatile, you can't count on collecting more than you projected. But when they do, they put some of that aside to a fire suppression fund. So looking at like where you can convert one-time money into a disaster preparedness on an ongoing basis is an interesting strategy.
Wonderful. One other question that came in, and I, because we want to definitely get to Anna here, but I also want to thank Senator Comerford. That was a terrific overview and a great example of things going on in your own district and how much it has impacted your district. The question that came in, and I'm not sure anyone would be able to answer this, but Senator Comerford, you might be able to talk about this in your own district, but how much of the economic impact that you saw or that we're seeing is from development in areas that have been at risk for kind of frequent weather events in past decades? Or is what's happening in your district pretty new? Or
that's less of an issue in Western Massachusetts, because we are quite rural and underdeveloped. So the issue is really about the historic use of the land. In our case, the Connecticut River, we use it, farmers pull from it for irrigation. And so we've always, for many years, right, lived close to this body of water. It happens that this body of water is growing more and more, vulnerable to climate change and to the impact of climate change. And so we have to adapt. Not like we've done something new, like built a big house on the bank of the Connecticut. These are farms really largely lining the Connecticut. And they can't coexist with that body of water anymore, as it is. And then, of course, we have built bridges over the Connecticut, and those, the bases of those bridges are, because of erosion, in peak flow moments, also threatened. But these are pretty historic structures. It's the thing that's changing is our climate that we have to adapt to.
Thank you, Senator. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And we have another great case study that we're going to be able to hear about and learn from, and that's from Minnesota in the Midwest. We're going to hear about some policy advances there that are helping legislators and budget leaders there get a better understanding of the costs of natural disasters and helping them develop appropriate fiscal plans and responses. And we really appreciate Anna Ming being here with us this morning. Anna serves as State Budget Director for Minnesota Management and Budget. She works closely with the governor's office, with state leaders, state agency leaders, legislative fiscal staff on all things fiscal policy and performance management and development and monitoring of state agency budgets. Anna, thank you so much for being with us and sharing some of the work that's being done in Minnesota.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, talk about our disaster assistance contingency account and some of our broader efforts around disaster funding. I apologize, I do not have as many beautiful or descriptive photos as Senator Comerford, but I do have a couple of charts, which is
love charts.
my favorite currency as well. So Minnesota, before 2014, we had a statutory framework where there were multiple state agencies and programs that were able to be activated for disaster response, but there was no dedicated state funding. If a disaster occurred, the response funding was generally appropriated by the legislature after the fact for each specific disaster. From 1997 to 2013, Minnesota had 7 special sessions to fund disaster response. We have a part-time legislature like many states who meet between January and February, depending on the year, and then ending in May, generally right before some of our worst disasters take place in the early summer period. And so what that meant was for our communities, the funding was unreliable and unpredictable. And sometimes it invited some political controversy. So which disasters should receive funding? If so, how much? What's the local share? You think of the non-federal share for a federal disaster. Would the state pick up the whole 25%? In some cases, yes. In other cases, we assumed the local government would pay for 10%. And then thinking about the timing, did it warrant a special session, or is it something that we could wait a full year to do? And so all of this over time culminated in a request for program evaluation of our disaster recovery efforts statewide by our Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is a nonpartisan office with a program evaluation division housed in our state legislature. So in 2012, our legislative auditor published a report really focused on community recovery. And the report was titled Helping Communities Recover from Natural Disaster. And they had a number of findings and recommendations, which I won't go into in great detail, but just highlighting some things relevant for this conversation, that there was inconsistent state funding for disasters, not a criteria of how much the state would cover, what percentage of the non-federal share. And so that created uncertainty for local governments, and it led to an unreliable and unpredictable funding model. So they recommended the creation of a dedicated account as well as clear criteria about what proportion of matching funds should be covered, as well as how to respond in the cases where a federal disaster isn't declared. As we've heard, the state-only disasters are a big thing in Minnesota as well. So that in 2014, something that Minnesota established in state law, housed in our Department of Public Safety, which is the agency that houses our Homeland Security and Emergency Management Division, the Disaster Assistance Contingency Account that was largely responsive to many of the findings in that OLA report. And it was established to ensure rapid response when the legislature wasn't in session to provide reliable and predictable funding for our local governments. It's an ongoing account, and when funds are transferred there from the state general fund, they don't cancel and they just roll forward until they're needed by a local or state government. It pays for, it's both state costs, but primarily local and tribal governments for costs incurred to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. So the way that the account is funded, before 2024, it was funded through one-time appropriations from the general fund, and the governor was statutorily required to recommend an amount of the estimated need in his biennial budget recommendations. But in 2024, we actually passed an automatic contingent transfer from the general fund to hit $50 million per biennium. So in the event that the general fund balance exceeded what we thought it would at the end of a biennial close. And so we will know in a few months of how the general fund closes for this biennium. We will close this biennium on June 30th, and then we can determine whether we will transfer additional funds to the disaster account up to that $50 million target level. So in order to leverage or access the account, you need a formal emergency declaration, either federal or state. In the event of a federal disaster where FEMA is covering that 75%, our account would reimburse the remaining 25%. In the event of a state disaster, the state would reimburse 75%, like the federal government would in a federal case, with the applicant responsible for the remaining 25%. This is also used as a cost share for Federal Highway Administration emergency relief and some USDA watershed protection as well. The damage threshold here is a lot lower than FEMA, so it would be, at or above 50% of that county per capita impact indicator for FEMA. So if it's 410 as the FEMA level, it'd be 205 or greater per person at the county level. And as I mentioned, it's both state agencies, county governments, cities, townships, school districts, tribal governments, and private utilities as well. So we have, since this was passed about 11 years ago, the account has funded over 80 disasters. We've transferred 227 million into the account and spent about 184 or allocated 184 to disasters. The legislature has not needed to meet in special session. We also are required to report on annually to the legislature so folks understand how the funds are being used. And I would say, Peter talked a lot about mitigation and resilience. And, although I'm not talking about that much today, we have really increased our investment in community resilience in the face of increasing disasters, in particular climate resilience. And we have a goal of all communities having a climate resilience plan by 2030. And we've devoted a significant funding to that over recent years. But what you can see on the chart is we had the use of our disaster account has been a lot higher in the last 5 years than in the first 5 years of the account. From 2015 to 2019, we spent about $8 million a year. And then from 2020 to 2024, it's been about $18 million a year on average. So there are a lot of positives that have come out of this account in Minnesota. It's been more reliable and predictable. We have a clear established process, and we can provide more timely response. Prior to the use of the account, state disasters got funding more slowly than federal, but now we're seeing this from start to close out state declared disasters are much faster than federal. But there are still challenges. Disaster spending is trending upwards, and right now we have this statutory target and sort of mental framework around $50 million a biennium, but I anticipate that will change. There are also political challenges that come with a set aside pool of funding that doesn't that is allocated by the executive branch rather than every decision being made at the legislative level. Um, we are seeing that since the threshold for accessing these funds is lower than FEMA, there may be different incentives for pursuing state versus federal relief. And then, as you've heard, and as everyone I'm sure is anticipating, the federal uncertainty is a looming threat for, or source of uncertainty rather, for us as well. Although we haven't had to spend 50 million per biennium out of this account, if the federal cost share or if the federal threshold was quadrupled, the number of state-only disasters would be significantly higher, and the current funding we have in the account would not be adequate. So with that, I'm always happy to take any questions about it if folks want to follow up afterwards, but that's it for me. So thank you so much.
Terrific, Anna. Well, actually, one thing that you mentioned there that went back to a question we had earlier that maybe I'll bring back to you in terms of what's going on in Minnesota. You mentioned that increased investment in climate resilience. Is that something that is done at the legislative level with their capital budgets, or is it more just kind of out of the regular general fund or other funding?
It is both. So that's a great question. We are, so Minnesota has an enterprise-wide strategic plan called the One Minnesota Plan, and one of the goals is climate resilience. We also have a climate action framework that is developed by an interagency sub-cabinet of like almost the entire cabinet, which is always funny to have a sub-cabinet, not very sub, but and it's really, we're trying to orient all of our spending to add a lens of resilience. So, and the capital budget side, we just passed a geo bonding bill that had significant funding for asset preservation. Like all of those decisions have a resilience lens on them as well. There's funding for flood hazard mitigation on bonding space, but we also in 2023 passed over $100 million for climate resilient communities grants, many of which are being used for like stormwater mitigation, which is an important resilience effort. So it's a sort of definitely a both and for us right now.
Great. And then the one question that you mentioned earlier, how when the governor comes up with his or her kind of budget proposal for the year, the governor is expected to put an amount that he or she thinks should be in this account. Can that account, how is that determined? It can be, because I've also seen that $50 million figure out there. Is that kind of what's in there now, or is that what has been suggested right now that should be in there?
Yeah, I think so far we've historically just had the sort of policy goal of hitting around 40 million a biennium, growing, I think more recently to 50, just as a result of inflation and increasing disasters. It's not right now a super scientific projection. It's just a level that has sustained us in recent years. I suspect that that's something we will need to be more scientific about as time goes on. And we have other funding sources where we have more nuanced projections. Like there is an open appropriation for firefighting costs for wildfires, for example, and that's a place where we are seeing increased spending as well and have a more we have a different projection model there.
Well, great, Anna. This is terrific. We did get kind of a more general question for everybody, but Anna, you're one of the states obviously highlighted here, and one of the questions was, what research has come out of these states that we've talked about, which other states might be able to utilize and support efforts to be best prepared as the climate change becomes more unpredictable and funding from the federal government unreliable. Then there's a question about this recording, whether it be sent to participants. We will send a recording to the participants. And Peter, I think we will want to send your report to all the participants as well. But in terms of the research coming out of these states and how we're tracking this, any suggestions on how if states are looking to like better prepare for climate change and this unreliability of the federal government, like how they can kind of get their hands around this and use the work of other states?
So that's a great question. The things that come to mind for me that our state is producing are, we are updating our climate action framework, which I think is an example of a very, very comprehensive way that Minnesota is approaching it through all levers of government, as well as we have I think a really robust site about our climate resilience grants, including like mapping and all the projects we're funding, which we're happy to share. But I'll need to think a little bit more about other research we might have. I know we're really active, a lot of people working on this.
Peter, Senator Comerford, or Trina, it looks like Trina's still be able to honest. Any suggestions on how states and leaders can kind of get a handle on this and prepare better? I mean,
so just two quick things from Massachusetts. One is I mentioned the environmental bond or a resilience bond that we imagine is coming soon from Governor Healy and her team. And in that, I know there's been a lot of planning about how to meet this moment with a changing federal climate and a changing climate, and how to make these programs easy to access, super nimble, very flexible, more quickly moving in Massachusetts so that we can really work with municipalities that may be understaffed themselves to be able to do this work. And then we're also looking at what does it really mean to do the work, right? If we don't have an infrastructure in a particular community, can they even apply for the grant? Can they implement the grant? So there's a lot of conversations at the state level about that. And then I'll just say in the Senate president called us into a smaller formation to actually look at things like this moment with a very, again, across many, many issues like healthcare or education, but we're looking at disaster preparedness and relief and what we in Massachusetts have to continue doing. We understand we just passed this disaster preparedness bill, but what else do we have to do? And our answer is probably a lot right now to be better prepared to act with our neighboring states in the absence of federal help.
Peter, did you want to add anything to?
I'll just chime in that the idea of being really proactive in budgeting for disasters, it's important under the status quo, just because disasters are becoming more expensive under the system we're used to. If that system were to change, that just the importance of that and the magnitude of the effort into that is going to just grow. But like those tools are are a big part of what was going to help you kind of get through any sort of adjustment.
Okay. Well, great. Well, really appreciate everybody, all the great questions and interaction, and also, of course, our speakers again. I want to thank Trina from the Trina Sheets from the National Emergency Management Association, Peter Muller from the Pew Charitable Trust, Senator Comerford from Massachusetts, and Anna Ming, Minnesota Budget Director. Really great insights and perspectives here. We will try to send out the recording and some other resources on this topic to everyone that's been on this call. It also will be available soon on our CSG Midwest site for you to see on our events page. And just a quick reminder to everyone with us today, the Council of State Governments is always looking to provide programming like this to help you advance your work in state legislatures and state governments. Please keep us in mind as a resource and let us know if you have ideas for future webinars, future in-person programming, future services that we can provide to you through resources. We're here to try to serve you in your state. So again, thank you to Anna, Senator Comerford, Trina, and Peter, and everyone on the call. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.